Now, Elementor yesterday released the beta version of 3.13, and one key feature that caught my attention is the ability now to start working with CSS Grid. Sure, we've had the Flexbox for a little while with the containers, but now CSS Grid opens up additional options. So we're going to delve into that a little bit and see what it has included in this early release and some of the things that I think are missing. We're also going to take a look at how it stacks up compared to Brix's version of CSS Grid. Now, they're very, very different tools, very different approaches, so I'm going to show you how they kind of differ. Now, first up, you do need to enable this feature. To access that, as we always do, you simply come over into Elementor, into Settings, and inside there you go over to Features and scroll through, and you'll see there's a new option for Grid Container. Make sure that's active. You also need to make sure you've got the Flexbox container active as well. They're kind of related to each other. This is an alpha version inside a beta release, or beta release if you're from the US, just so you don't jump and lynch me. Just saying. Okay, so once that's been enabled in this beta version, we now have access to that option. So first of all, let me just cover off what we have set up. I've created a container, which is your parent container, and inside there we have 4 containers. Each one of those simply contains a heading element, and that's where we get the 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can see each one of these is color-coded so you can see what's going on. Okay, so let's go back to our parent container. If we come over to the left-hand side, you'll see we get a new option underneath the layout options for this, and it says container layout is set to Flexbox, and underneath are all the normal Flexbox options. However, this new option gives us the ability to change over to grids. If we select that, you can see this now puts us into a 2-row, 2-column grid layout, and everything is laid out equally. Now, if we come over underneath where we've got this switched over to grids, you'll see now we have some new options. You can see we have grid outlines, and this will show us basically just an outline version of the grid boxes. So at the moment, we've got a 2-column, 2-row grid. Let's change the columns over to 3. And you see now what happens is it all compensates for that change in columns and rows. So if we take this to be, for example, 1 row, you can see nothing happens because we have this set to 3 columns. We have to have that second row. Again, if we set this to be 3, you can see even though we can visually see these kind of placeholders using the grid show option, nothing's actually inside there. However, if we change this over now to columns and set this to be 1, you can see that now fills everything out. So far, all pretty basic, and you're probably thinking, well, it's not really something you couldn't do by using the Flexbox model, and you'd be right, you pretty much could. But there is more flexibility in here. So let's set these back to be 2 by 2, just like Noah and the Ark. Now, you'll notice that we have the option to control the units that are being used. So you can see it says FR, which is basically just a fraction of the overall size of this particular container, and everything is broken up equally inside there. You can, if you want to, change this over to be option for custom, and then you can manually type in what you want as opposed to using those FR kind of pre-default values. Now, we'll come back to that in a moment, so set that back to be the standard FR. Now, underneath, you'll see you've got row and column gaps. So this allows you to control the spacing in between your rows and your columns. Again, very similar to the kinds of things you could do inside Flexbox. You can see we can choose between pixels, Ms, rems, and so on, and you can even use the new option for creating custom values inside here. So, for example, let's keep it to the pixel value, and let's say we want to put 100, and you can see that now gives us 100 for the horizontal and the vertical, the columns and the gaps. However, if you don't want to link those together, you can just click the little chain link, and then you can adjust these. So we'll say we want to do something like this. So we now have a 100 pixel gap between the columns and a 20 pixel gap between the rows. All pretty simple and straightforward. You've got control of then your auto flow and your justification of your items inside there. Now, I'm controlling everything inside here based upon the containers inside anyway, so I'm not going to worry too much about those. They're not really going to do much in this example. Okay, so let's go back to that option where we can set up the units of measurement for the columns and the rows. Now, currently you can see when we make changes, everything is basically equal. As we increase or decrease the size of each one of these columns, each one of these sort of cells, we'll say, is exactly the same. And you don't always want that. And this is where the flexibility of using something like the CSS Grid opens up more possibilities for creating these more unique layouts. So for example, let's change this now for the columns. We'll switch this over to be the option for custom, and we're going to use the FR rule. In other words, instead of just using FR for this drop down, we're going to manually insert it. So what we can do is we can say we want the first item here to be 2FR. In other words, take up 2 spaces on the screen. So we do 2FR. And you see that now takes up the space, but nothing else is kind of happening because we haven't set any other rules. So now if we just do 1FR, you can see now what happens is the box 1 takes up 2 column widths, whereas box 2 takes up a single column width. So this is where you start to get into that flexibility of creating more customized layouts. Now let's go into the row side of things. Let's do the same thing inside there. Let's change this over to custom values. And what we can do now is we can control the actual size of the rows. So let's say we want the first row to be 500 pixels. And we want the second row to be 200 pixels. Well, we can pop those in, and you can see now that controls the size as this. So we're kind of mixing and matching the column using the FR units, and we're using the pixel values then for the height. But you can mix and match if you want to. So there's a lot more you can do this. I don't want to go into too much detail because I think it's going to be too much in the way of sort of like explaining how CSS Grid works. This is more a case of just demonstrating how you can start to interact with it using this beta version. Okay, so we could, if we wanted to, change and get rid of these FRs, and we could use values. So for example, in say 2FR for the first one, and then we're going to say 300 pixels for the second one. So that now is 300 pixels wide. And again, if we change this over to something like 200, you'll see that changes. 100. So you can see these are basically mixing and matching various different types of values. And this is where you start to kind of get into the benefits of using something like CSS Grid. Now this is still relatively early on. This is the first sort of alpha release of this feature inside Elementor. So there are still some limitations. You can get around them by writing custom CSS code. And again, like I say, check out Imran's second video because he kind of covers some of this inside there. But if you don't want to, and I think this is where a lot of people would be more happy, this is their kind of happy places where they don't have to kind of get in and start writing custom CSS code. The fact you can actually use these values inside here is pretty useful and pretty simple and straightforward, but you do need to understand how CSS Grid actually works. So that's the basics of how you can do it inside here. There are, like I say, some still limitations inside the editor itself. However, let's just jump over into the version inside Bricks Builder, and you can see I've created a similar kind of layout. Let's select our container. But you'll notice these are all still numbered sequentially, but they're not being displayed sequentially. So this is where the benefit of using sort of CSS Grid really comes in. You can change not only the size and the space and all those kinds of things, you can also change where inside the grid each different element is actually positioned. And this is where I think it makes it a little bit easier using Bricks Builder to do this, but you do still need to have a pretty solid understanding of how CSS Grid works. And I will put a link to the documentation to working with CSS Grid inside Bricks Builder in the description below. There's a lot of really good examples inside there of how to get started using it. And I would recommend taking a read of that if you want to delve into this using Bricks Builder. But let's come back over and let's take a look at what options we have. Once you change this over from Flex, which you can see is the standard kind of layout, and we go over to Grid, in the same way that it changes inside Elementor, we now open up the options inside Bricks Builder to do what we've just seen and a little bit more, but inside the editor. You can see that we've got the grid template rows. We've set those to be 300 and 600 pixels high, so they're kind of explicit values. But most of the magic in this layout isn't going on at this level. It's actually going on at the block level. Now, if we take a quick look at the way that I've set things up here, this works a little different to the way you would inside Elementor. So let me just quickly go over. The section is the parent container, if you will, when you take a look at something like Elementor. And inside there, we've got a container, which is the nested inner container, which is set to be the sort of width of the page. The section itself is full width. And inside there, we've got 4 blocks. All of these are basically containers, just they're interacted with and labeled slightly differently in Bricks Builder. So if you're not a Bricks Builder user, this might be a little confusing, but it does make a lot of sense once you get into it. So if we select one of the blocks, so come out to the left-hand side now, you see we've got these grid item options, and there are 2 options inside here, grid column and grid row. And this allows you to control the row and column position of this specific block level element. In this example, it's the first block level element, and as you can see, it's just taking up all 3 rows and only the first column. Whereas if we take a look at the third one, which is this third block, you can see this is taking up 2 column widths, and this is in the first position, but it's kind of stacking orders and all this kinds of stuff. It all kind of gets a bit confusing if you don't understand it. But what I want to kind of demonstrate here is that you have more control currently inside Bricks Builder that allows you to not only control the sort of width and the height, but also the position and all these other kind of good things you can do with CSS Grid. this is a lesson in itself, and to be honest, CSS Grid, once you get your head around it, is very flexible. And there's times where this makes a lot more sense over Flexbox, and other times where Flexbox makes more sense over CSS Grid. But hopefully what this has demonstrated in a kind of a bit of a mishmashy kind of way is it's good to see that Elementor are now bringing in these more advanced features that a lot of people have been crying out for a very long time. So kudos for doing that. So let me wrap up my thoughts and feelings about this first release of the CSS Grid in Elementor and some of the things that I kind of feel are hampering moving forward with Elementor. First of all, kudos for actually listening to people. It might have taken a long time, but it's nice to see that CSS Grid and Flexbox now are being included, even though this is still in alpha and Flexbox is still in beta. It's good to see that we do actually start to have these functions and it's being taken on board. It would be nice if this was a little bit more obvious that you could actually do some of these things, because my first impression, based upon Imran's first video and my testing, was that you didn't have control over these FR units and so on. So that was a mistake on my part. I know Imran's released a second video to cover some of the other things that he didn't cover in his first video, so the links to those are in the description below. And thanks to some of the people over on the actual Facebook group to point me in the right direction to say, actually, Paul, you can do these things. So it's good you can. The only downside for me is it's kind of hidden away and it's not really sort of a front and center thing. So nice to have these sliders, but that really hides away the power of CSS Grid and kind of makes it semi-useless having it done that way. However, all of that is kind of by the by at this point in time, because all these things are being held back by the container, the Flexbox container, still being a beta release inside experimental features. Now, I know a lot of people are actually using this and they're comfortable using it, but my recommendation is always, when you've got a beta release of something as key and important as this, I wouldn't use this in production sites, because the reality of it is, if something gets changed on a kind of fundamental low level, all of your hard work could be undone and you have to go and do a lot of remedial work to go and fix things, especially annoying if you're doing it on a client site. So at some point, it would be nice to get the container out of the experimental phase, out of beta phase, into a final release. And then all these other things that are kind of being built up behind it like a dam would actually come out, and we'd be able to have things like these nested containers or these nested kind of features for accordions and tabs and so on. We could then get the CSS Grid and all the other things that are kind of being held back by the container and the Flexbox model. That's my kind of frustration. I hope this is something that they will treat as a priority and push it forward and get the feature out. It's just, oh, come on. Please, Elementor, just bloody do it. Okay, so that's my thoughts, but as always, I would welcome your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section down below. As always, all applicable links are in the description. My name is Paul C. This is WPTuts, and until next time, take care.